Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I wanted to give you a whole bunch of book recommendations surrounding the theme of dark academia. Now recently, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, I put out a vlog where I was speaking about The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and I did a deep dive into the dark academia aesthetic, but I asked you guys if you wanted to see a dark academia recommendations video, and a lot of people said yes, so here we are with that video. Now if you don't know what dark academia is, if this is the very first video you're clicking on about dark academia, it's essentially an aesthetic. It centers around this sort of idealized aesthetic of what it must be like to be studying English literature or ancient Greek at a prestigious university. If you want to watch me doing a deep dive on dark academia, there is that video which I uploaded a couple weeks ago, which I will link in the description down below. But before we get into today's recommendations, I did want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Ana Luisa. Now Ana Luisa are a beautiful, ethical, sustainable jewelry company, which I really love. They've recently sent me a few more pieces. So we have these earrings, which are the Charis earrings, and also the Beck's mini earrings as well. I just think they're so lovely and dainty and elegant. And also this necklace as well, which is the Noelle necklace, which was designed by the lovely Noelle Gallagher. She makes really wonderful book content, so I will link her channel in the description down below. But it's just so delicate and dainty, and I really love it. So if you're looking for some really beautiful, ethical, sustainable holiday gifts for the holiday season, I definitely recommend Ana Luisa. They're currently having their holiday sale at the moment. So that sale is buy one item, get 15% off, buy two items, get 20% off, and buy 3 or more items and you get 25% off. So please feel free to go ahead and click the link in the description down below and check out Ana Luisa. So kicking it off with the most influential dark academia book, which I've literally already mentioned in this video, but it is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. The reason why I'm including this book in this list, even though it's incredibly obvious, is just in case anyone hasn't heard of this book. I definitely don't want to leave it out. It follows a young man whose name is Richard. He's 19, he's from California, and he moves to an elite university in New England. At the beginning of the book, he's intending on studying English literature, but he stumbles across this group of 5 students and their very eccentric lecturer whose name is Julian Morrow. The class only has those 5 students in it, and they all study ancient Greek. And so Richard eventually ends up joining this little group and being indoctrinated into their little world. And so really, I do think that this is a coming of age story for Richard as he discovers this little world that these students have, and he sort of learns that the beauty of this world is inextricably linked with this sort of darkness and evilness that's hidden underneath it. The writing in this book is so beautiful. I really loved the writing here. I thought this book was incredibly suspenseful, and one of the things that the book does is it reveals the murder on the very first page. So the very first sentence of the prologue is, "The snow on the mountains was melting and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation." It reveals the murder in the very first line, and despite this, it's still incredibly suspenseful. Here is a clip of me gasping during the end of this book. And the reason why Donna Tartt wanted to reveal the murder on the very first page is because in the Iliad, all of the big tragedies are in the first 6 lines. And so she really was interested by this idea of how do you create a suspenseful novel, even though you've already revealed what's going to happen on the very first page. I think this is a really brilliant book. I think all of the characters are wonderfully fleshed out. I think they're all terrible people. I just enjoyed my time reading this book so much, and I really do recommend it if you're interested in dark academia and you have not read it yet. Book number 2 on this list is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Chbosky. I'm so sorry if that's wrong. This is a book which I don't really hear people talking about anymore, which makes me kind of sad because it's a really wonderful book. This is a story of a young boy, or rather a teenager, whose name is Charlie. It's a coming of age story, so it's a Bildungsroman, and it's also an epistolary novel because the novel is set in letters. We don't know who Charlie is writing these letters to, but we do know that he's a very introspective young man, and he is a wallflower, so he's very shy and passive, and he doesn't really know how to talk to people. He sort of feels very alienated all the time, and this is the story of how he meets these 2 older students and they sort of bring him out of his shell. Again, it's a coming of age story. The reason why it's dark academia is because it's set in a school. Obviously Charlie is in high school, but there are also some really dark elements here, particularly to do with mental health and trauma. There are some content warnings here, which I won't tell you because it's a significant spoiler for the book, but if you are a person who needs content warnings, I do recommend you go looking them up before reading this book. It is just such a beautiful book, and I read this as a teenager and it was really influential to me. The movie came out, I think, when I was in year 11 or year 12. It was a really, really influential movie to me as well, and I love that movie, but this is just such a wonderful, wonderful book, and I think it really does have the aesthetic that people are looking for with Dark Academia. Like, there's a lot of chain smoking in here, for example. The kids are interested in alternative music, stuff like that, while like really exploring some really important themes and Charlie's trauma, and I just love this book. I think it's really, really beautiful. Book number 3 on this list is actually in a similar vein, and it is Looking for Alaska by John Green. Again, a book I don't really hear people talking about very much anymore, but a book that I absolutely love. Again, the first time I read it, I was a teenager, and it was really, really fundamental to me. It's also another book which is structurally interesting. It's set in a school, and it has some really dark theming as well. This is a story about a young man whose name is Miles. He's in high school as well, so both of these books are actually YA. Miles has just moved to a boarding school. He's another introspective young man who feels very alienated. Actually, this is a significant theme in Dark Academia, I'm noticing. This is his coming of age story, and at this boarding school he meets a girl named Alaska. I think you can definitely look at this book from like a manic pixie dream girl lens with Alaska. Like, I think it easily falls into that trope, but if that doesn't annoy you, then I really, really, really love this book. It's structurally interesting because all of the chapters are counting down to something, but you don't know what. So it starts off with 136 days before, and it keeps counting down to this event. Again, set in a school, some really dark themes, some really heavy themes in here, but I think what I particularly love about this book is the writing. I think my very favorite quote from this book is like the last 2 lines of the book, and I don't think those last 2 lines are a spoiler in any way, but if you don't want to hear them, please skip to this time because I'm about to read them out. I just think they're so beautiful and I want to share them. Okay, we're safe, because there's this theme the whole way through in this book of Miles being very interested in people's last words and what that meant about their lives and things like that. The last 2 lines of this book are, Thomas Edison's last words were, "It's very beautiful over there. I don't know where there is, but I believe it's somewhere and I hope it's beautiful." And oh my God, I love that so much. I think this is such a wonderful book, and it definitely falls into the theming of Dark Academia. It's set at a school, it has some dark themes, and there are also these really beautiful quotes throughout the book of like people's last words. For some reason, smoking a lot of cigarettes is again a thing that happens in this book, but yes, like the cool kid aesthetic is in this as well. Anyway, I just really love this book and I definitely recommend it. The next book on this list is probably a book that many of you are sick of me recommending, but I'm gonna recommend it anyway, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is probably my favorite classic of all time. I've reread it a bunch of times. I love the story to pieces. I think this is a really, really wonderful book for the Dark Academia aesthetic because of the themes that it explores. So Frankenstein is a story about a man whose name is Dr. Victor Frankenstein. There's been some arguments in my videos about the fact that he didn't graduate university. So is he technically a doctor? I don't actually know. He refers to himself as a doctor, so he can be Dr. Victor Frankenstein. I don't mind. Towards the beginning of the novel, Victor is obsessed with this idea of creating life from nothing, and he's studying at a university in Geneva. He ends up doing a whole bunch of grave robbing, which is super unethical, to create this like monstrous creature who he ends up animating and comes to life. The monster wakes up and Victor Frankenstein realizes that he's done a terrible, terrible thing in creating life. He's played God, he's done a bad thing. The monster escapes into the night and the story sort of follows on from there. This is another epistolary novel, so it's a novel set in letters. It's also a story within a story within a story. So we kick off the story with Walton, who's on a ship, who stumbles across a man who's out in the snow, who ends up being Victor Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein ends up saying, "Let me tell you the story of what happened to me," dives into his perspective, and then we dive a level deeper into the monster's perspective later on in the story. So this story is dark, it's a gothic tale, and so it has all of the like gothic archetypes in it. We have terror in the form of an unseen monster following Victor along, things from people's pasts coming back to bite them, that sort of theming. But it's also academia because there's such a theming in this book of knowledge and like the thirst for knowledge. Walton, for example, is very, very insecure because he's not a learned man. He hasn't, had the privileges in his life of studying, and so he wants to make this big scientific discovery on his ship. And then of course we go into Victor, who is like a keen scholar who goes too far with the scholarly pursuits that he is pursuing. How do I words? But genuinely, I love this book so much, which is why I always recommend it. Mary Shelley wrote this as a teenager. She single-handedly invented the science fiction genre with this book, and I just think it's so brilliant. The way it sort of examines the theming of like man versus God and nature versus industrialization and knowledge versus power and all of this stuff I think is really, really wonderful. It is such an influential story, and I think if you like Dark Academia, you'll definitely like this book. Another classic to add to our list is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is probably my second favorite classic of all time. I just think it's absolutely wonderful, and I have this copy which is just stunning. It's so pretty. It's another gothic classic. I think if you're into dark academia, definitely check out like the gothic literature genre, because I think it's really going to suit you. The Secret History very much had a lot of gothic elements to it, and I think you could probably say it's a gothic novel. This is a story about a young man, another one, Dorian Gray, and he is very beautiful. He's just this very handsome looking fellow. At the beginning of the novel, we're in this scene where there's a painter named Basil who's painting him, and he has this realization once the painting is finished that he will never ever be as lovely as he is on this one day, because he's always going to age from this point on. He's always going to get older and more haggard, and he has this sudden sort of vain want to always stay as young and as beautiful as he is on that day. And he ends up taking the painting with him and like coveting this painting and hiding it away. Somehow, it's never explained how this happens, but somehow this does actually come true. And so the painting ends up living in Dorian Gray's attic and becomes older and more haggard as time goes on, and Dorian never ages. And so it sort of follows Dorian's story along as he kind of delves into darkness, and he becomes a worse and worse person while always looking just as lovely as he did that day before he was tainted. It's probably the least academic book on this list, but I genuinely really feel like it suits people who love The Secret History, and I really do feel like it's a good book for people who like dark academia. There's a lot of like long-winded discussions about politics and ethics and things in here. There's a lot of very decadent imagery in here because Dorian Gray is quite wealthy. Really love the picture of Dorian Gray, and I think it's definitely a perfect book if you like dark academia, despite the fact that there's less academia in this book than in the other books on this list. The next book I want to recommend is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Very much fits the vibe. It's also, I think, the only story on this list that features a woman as a main character, which is kind of sad, but anyway. Never Let Me Go is a story about a young woman whose name is Kathy H. And we start off with her as an adult, as a 31-year-old, and she starts to tell the story of her childhood and her time at this boarding school in the English countryside. This is a novel which has a lot of twists and turns, and one of the things I really love about Kazuo Ishiguro's work is that his work is not really defined by genre. He sort of like writes outside of genre. If you've read the book The Buried Giant, it's a book that like really like interestingly sits in this space between fantasy, historical, and like literary fiction. It's a really interesting book. This one is a beautiful story that absolutely ripped my heart out. This book has some really dark and heavy themes in it, some really like important themes about humanity and morality and ethics and how we treat people. This book falls into a couple of different genres, and I went into this book thinking that it was just going to be a regular contemporary lit novel. That's the best way to go into this book, so please don't Google it, please don't look up the genre. It is a kind of delightful and heartbreaking surprise when you get to it. I really love the characterization of Kathy. I love the setting of the school. I love that this book ripped my heart out and absolutely stamped all over it. A very beautiful story, and I really do love Kazuo Ishiguro. The very next book on this list is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. This is a book that I have a dedicated book review on my channel for. That video still gets views for some reason. I'm not particularly proud of that review anymore, but it's there and people still comment on it. Anyway, this is another coming of age story about a young man whose name is Toru, and he, at the beginning of the story, is much older. He's sitting in an airplane and he hears the song Norwegian Wood by the Beatles. And with him sitting in that airplane listening to that song, the memories of his time in college come back to him. And so the time when he was in college was during the 60s in Tokyo. It was a time period where there were a lot of student protests going on, and he starts to remember the girl he loved, whose name is Naoko. There are some significant content warnings with this one, particularly surrounding mental health amongst other things. There's one particularly problematic scene in this book that I feel the need to flag every time I talk about it, just because I don't want people to read the book and get to that scene and be like, what the fuck, Christy? Why did you recommend this? Beautifully written. I think it has some really wonderful imagery, and I really love this book from the perspective of reading about Tokyo in the 1960s. Like, I love the way the setting is depicted. In many ways, a very sad book. Of course, it's academia because it's set in a college for the most part, and we see Toru's life as he's a college student, and we also get to see these relationships with all these other people. And of course, it's dark because there's some really heavy themes here. I would recommend, if you're feeling down, if you're not in a great headspace, maybe wait a while to read this book, because it kind of leaves you feeling forlorn and sad and dead inside. I made a comment about The Secret History that I don't think I'd felt that dead inside after reading a book since finishing Norwegian Wood, but it is beautifully, beautifully written, and I definitely think if you like dark academia, you will like this book. The two final books I want to talk about are Furunesi by Susanna Clarke and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. These two books probably have the strongest like speculative elements of the list. Furunesi is a story about a person who is trapped in a house. The person is referred to as Furunesi, and he believes that the house is the entire world. The house is this enormous labyrinthine construction that has all of these like old statues and paintings, but it also contains the ocean, and there are tides flowing in and out. Furunesi is obsessed with journaling. He's a very meticulous person. He really likes writing everything down. So he's tracking the tides and he tracks the house, and he is sort of the expert on the house. There's one other person in the house whose name is the Other. This is the only person Furunesi comes into contact with, so he is very alienated and alone, and the story like structurally is very interesting. It's another epistolary novel because it's set in journal entries. There's a lot of like citations lists and indexes and things like that, which I think add a really cool element to it, which make it feel more academic. I really, really love the dark vibe. I think if you love the dark academia aesthetic and you really enjoyed The Secret History, but you want something a little bit more weird and speculative, this is a very, very good book. And then finally, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. These two books, honestly, could not be more different. Like in terms of the style, the writing style, the theming, the length, they could not be more different, which is why I feel comfortable placing both of them on this list. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is the most fantasy-oriented book on this list. Although it's a very unique fantasy story. This is a story set in like the Napoleonic era, so early 1800s, I think, about these two men who want to bring magic back to England. This story is enormous. It is 280,000 words. There are these footnotes with this tiny, tiny text throughout the story where you get like these excerpts from magic books and history books. And so we find out more about this world through these tiny little footnotes. The story is mostly concerned about the academia of magic and the learning of magic. And we have our two main characters who are Jonathan, who is a much younger magician, and Mr. Norrell, who is an older one who's quite stuffy and particular about how he thinks magic should be used and spoken about. I think, for example, if you've already read A Picture of Dorian Gray and loved it, and if you also love fantasy stories, you'll really, really like this book. This is the least dark book on the list. I think it's the least heavy book on this list. There's nowhere in this book where I felt like I was going to cry, but there are still some reasonably heavy elements. Like it's not quite the level of like Norwegian Wood or The Secret History, but I do think that there is some like significant depth here. The book is just so very unique. It's enormous. The world building is amazing. I love the use of like fairy folklore in here, and also showing the fairies as these like sort of like dark creatures that come from nature, which I really, really loved as well. I think this is such a brilliant book and definitely falls into the dark academia category with much more of a like fantastical spin. This might be the first video I've done in a very long time where all of the books I have to speak about are actually physical copies. Look at this stack of books. This is such a stack. Honestly, the most weight I lift ever is when I'm trying to take a thumbnail for these types of videos. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and getting to hear my favorite dark academia books that I've read. Please let me know your book recommendations as well, particularly dark academia books that feature more women in them. I would really, really appreciate that. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video, and also an enormous thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting my channel. We have a lot of fun bonus content over there. If you'd like to check it out, there is a link in the description down below. Take care, guys, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.